The greatest mistake you can make is believing that a person's worth is measured by the clothes they wear. On a crisp Saturday morning in downtown Chicago, the Carter Foundation hosted its annual charity gala, a glamorous event where politicians, celebrities, and business leaders gathered beneath sparkling chandeliers to celebrate generosity. Luxury sedans lined the entrance, photographers called out famous names, and guests in designer suits smiled confidently as they stepped onto the red carpet. Just beyond the velvet ropes, unnoticed by almost everyone, an elderly homeless woman stood quietly on the sidewalk. Her silver hair was neatly tied beneath a faded scarf, and although her long brown coat had clearly seen better days, she had carefully brushed every wrinkle from it before sunrise. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that hardship had never managed to erase. Clutched gently in her weathered hands was a small gift box wrapped in old blue paper, protected inside a grocery bag so the morning breeze would not damage it. She looked toward the grand entrance with hopeful eyes, whispering softly to herself that today might finally be the day. She had traveled across the city using 2 buses and walked nearly a mile after spending the last of her spare change on the fare. She was tired, hungry, and cold, yet none of that mattered. All she wanted was to see the young man whose face appeared on every banner surrounding the event. Ethan Carter, the billionaire CEO whose foundation promised to change lives, smiled from enormous posters hanging above the entrance. Evelyn gazed at his photograph as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. She smiled through them, as though looking at someone she had loved forever. Before she could take another step, a security guard moved in front of her with a polite but unmistakably firm expression. "Ma'am, this event is invitation only." Evelyn nodded gently. "I understand. I only need a minute. I have something important to give Mr. Carter." The guard glanced at the worn grocery bag, then back at her clothing. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to leave the property." Nearby guests slowed their pace, some pretending not to stare, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman in an expensive cream-colored suit frowned and quietly muttered that people always tried to take advantage of charity events. Another guest shook his head without ever looking Evelyn in the eyes. She lowered her gaze, tightened her grip on the little package, and softly thanked the guard anyway. Instead of arguing, she stepped away from the entrance and sat alone on a nearby bench across the street, where she continued watching the celebration from a distance. Minutes later, a convoy of black SUVs rolled toward the building as photographers rushed forward in excitement. Evelyn slowly stood, her tired eyes fixed on the first vehicle. As Ethan Carter stepped onto the red carpet surrounded by executives and cameras, Evelyn's lips trembled. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she whispered almost silently, "My son." But no one around her heard those words, and no one noticed that the homeless old woman staring through the crowd was carrying a secret that could change every life inside that building. Evelyn remained on the weathered bench as laughter and applause drifted across the street from the charity gala. She carefully placed the little blue package on her lap and folded her hands over it, as though it contained the last piece of hope she had left. The cold wind swept through the city, but she hardly noticed. Her attention never left the entrance where Ethan greeted honored guests with a warm smile that reminded her of someone she had loved more than anything in the world. Hours passed slowly. Expensive cars continued arriving while volunteers carried flowers and decorations into the ballroom. Nobody noticed the elderly woman sitting quietly across the street, except a young food delivery driver who stopped beside her with a paper bag. "Ma'am, I ordered lunch for myself, but I have more than I need. Would you like this?" Evelyn looked up with grateful eyes and smiled gently. "Thank you, young man. That is very kind of you." She accepted the sandwich, but before taking a single bite, She noticed another homeless veteran sitting beneath a nearby bridge. Without hesitation, she walked over and handed him half of the meal. "You should keep it," the man said softly. Evelyn simply smiled. Food always tastes better when it is shared. The veteran nodded with quiet appreciation as she returned to her bench, carrying only the remaining half. She ate slowly, making every bite last, then carefully folded the empty wrapper and placed it in a nearby trash can. Even after years without a home, she refused to leave a mess behind. As afternoon sunlight reflected from the glass tower surrounding the Foundation headquarters, memories quietly filled her heart. She remembered holding a little boy's hand while crossing a busy street many years ago. She remembered reading bedtime stories until he fell asleep with his head resting against her shoulder. She remembered promising him that no matter what happened, a mother's love would always find its way home. Life, however, had taken a path she never imagined. One heartbreaking misunderstanding had separated them for decades, and every attempt to find him had ended in silence. Still, she never stopped believing they would meet again. Across the street, inside the elegant ballroom, Ethan greeted donors with confidence. Yet something inside him felt strangely unsettled. His assistant quietly reminded him that interviews would begin in 15 minutes, but Ethan's attention drifted toward the large windows overlooking the city plaza. For reasons he could not explain, he felt as though someone important was nearby. Outside, Evelyn reached into the pocket of her old coat and gently touched a delicate silver locket hidden beneath the fabric. Inside rested a faded photograph and a tiny hospital bracelet she had protected for more than 30 years. She whispered a quiet prayer before closing the locket once again. At that exact moment, an elderly housekeeper carrying fresh linens toward the ballroom entrance happened to glance across the street. The moment her eyes landed on Evelyn's face, she stopped walking completely, her expression changing from simple curiosity to stunned disbelief. The elderly housekeeper stood frozen at the entrance, her stack of freshly pressed table linen slipping slightly in her arms as she stared across the street. Her name was Martha Reynolds, and she had worked for the Carter family longer than anyone still employed by the company. Time had added gray to her hair, but it had not erased the memories she carried. She narrowed her eyes, hardly believing what she was seeing. The woman sitting quietly on the park bench looked older, thinner, and far more tired than she remembered. Yet there was something impossible to mistake. It was the gentle smile. It was the graceful way she folded her hands. It was the familiar silver locket resting against her coat. Martha whispered to herself, "It cannot be." Before she could step forward, a sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. The event director reminded everyone that the press conference would begin in only a few minutes. Martha hesitated, looking from the ballroom doors back to the lonely bench across the street. By the time she turned again, several guests had walked between them, and Evelyn had quietly disappeared from view. Across the plaza, Evelyn had noticed a little girl crying beside a decorative fountain while her anxious father searched frantically among the crowd. Without drawing attention to herself, she gently approached the child and knelt beside her. "Your father is looking for you," she said with a warm smile. "Let us stay right here so he can find you." Within moments, the relieved father spotted his daughter and rushed over with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I do not know what I would have done." Evelyn simply smiled and wished them a wonderful day before walking away without waiting for another word. Several people nearby witnessed the small act of kindness, but most returned to their conversations without giving it another thought. Inside the grand ballroom, Ethan stepped onto the stage as applause filled the room. He thanked donors for supporting scholarships, shelters, and family assistance programs, speaking with calm confidence. Yet even while cameras flashed around him, he found himself glancing toward the towering windows overlooking the plaza. A strange feeling lingered in his heart, as though someone important had come close enough to change his life forever. His chief of staff quietly leaned toward him and reminded him that a private luncheon with major investors would begin immediately after the speech. Ethan nodded politely, but his thoughts remained elsewhere. Meanwhile, Martha could no longer ignore the growing feeling inside her. She hurried through a service hallway until she reached a quiet storage room where old company photographs were kept for anniversary displays. With trembling hands, she opened a faded album from decades earlier. As she turned another page, her breath caught. There, smiling beside a much younger version of the Carter family, stood the same woman she had just seen outside. Martha stared at the photograph in complete disbelief before looking back toward the ballroom doors. If her memory was right, then the lonely homeless woman everyone had ignored was connected to the Carter family in a way almost no one alive still remembered. While guests applauded another announcement inside the ballroom, Martha closed the old photo album with trembling hands and hurried toward the executive offices. Her heart pounded with every step. She had spent more than 3 decades serving the Carter family, and she knew the history almost no one else remembered. Years ago, after a tragic series of misunderstandings and legal disputes following the sudden death of Ethan's father, Evelyn had disappeared without leaving a trace. Every investigation eventually reached the same heartbreaking conclusion. She had simply vanished. Ethan had grown up believing that she was gone forever, and every search his company funded had ended in disappointment. Martha whispered, "It cannot be her." But if it is, before she could reach Ethan, she was intercepted by Lauren Mitchell, the foundation's polished public relations director. Lauren noticed the dusty photo album under Martha's arm and frowned. "The investors are waiting. Why are you wandering through restricted areas?" Martha tried to steady her voice. "I need to speak with Mr. Carter immediately. It is about someone outside." Lauren glanced at the old photograph for barely a second before dismissing it. "This is not the time for old family stories. We have national media here today." Martha hesitated, then quietly insisted, "Please, I think I saw someone he's been searching for." Lauren sighed impatiently. "Our guests expect perfection. The last thing we need is another distraction from someone standing outside asking for attention." Without waiting for another response, she instructed 2 event coordinators to make certain the entrance remained clear of anyone who did not belong at the gala. Meanwhile, Evelyn slowly walked along the edge of the plaza, hoping to catch one brief glimpse of Ethan after the speeches ended. She held the small blue package close to her chest. Inside was an old birthday card, written in a child's uneven handwriting, a drawing of a smiling family, and a tiny wooden toy car Ethan had once insisted she keep forever. Those simple treasures had survived every difficult year because they reminded her that love could outlast time. She paused near a flower bed and watched volunteers carry donated winter coats into a truck. One young volunteer accidentally dropped a box of children's books across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Evelyn knelt carefully and helped gather every book, dusting each cover before handing it back with a gentle smile. "Thank you," the volunteer said warmly. "You are very kind." Evelyn simply answered, "Kindness costs nothing, but it can change someone's entire day." At that exact moment, Ethan's motorcade began moving toward a private side entrance after his speech concluded. His vehicle slowed briefly because workers were crossing the driveway with equipment. Sitting inside the back seat, Ethan casually looked through the tinted window. For only a heartbeat, his eyes met those of the elderly woman helping the volunteer. An unfamiliar feeling rushed through him so suddenly that he instinctively told his driver, "Wait. I feel like I know her somehow." Ethan leaned slightly toward the window, unable to explain why the elderly woman's face stirred emotions he had buried years ago. "Should I continue, sir?" the driver asked quietly. Ethan hesitated for only a second before a security officer opened the rear door to remind him that investors, reporters, and city officials were already waiting inside the executive dining room. Duty won the moment. Ethan nodded once, and the motorcade rolled forward through the private entrance, leaving the plaza behind. Across the sidewalk, Evelyn never realized the man inside the black vehicle had been looking directly at her. She adjusted the strap of her worn grocery bag and began walking toward a nearby bus stop, believing another opportunity had slipped away. She told herself not to lose hope. If she could not speak to him today, perhaps tomorrow would bring another chance. Inside the headquarters, Martha could no longer remain silent. Ignoring Lauren's objections, she made her way through a service corridor until she reached Ethan's executive assistant, Daniel Brooks. "Daniel," she said with unusual urgency, "I need 5 minutes with Mr. Carter. It concerns his family." Daniel looked surprised. During all the years he had worked there, Martha had never interrupted an executive event without good reason. "What happened?" he asked. Martha carefully opened the old photo album and pointed to a faded picture taken more than 30 years earlier. Daniel studied the smiling young woman standing beside Ethan's parents. Then he looked back at Martha. "Why are you showing me this?" Martha answered softly. "Because I believe I saw her outside less than an hour ago." Daniel frowned. "That cannot be possible." Martha nodded slowly. "I pray I am wrong, but if I am right, every minute matters." At the same time, Lauren noticed the conversation from across the hallway. She walked over with composed confidence and closed the album without even examining it carefully. "This foundation cannot chase every rumor that appears during a public event," she said firmly. "We have spent years dealing with people who claim connections to wealthy families." Martha looked directly into Lauren's eyes. "I'm not talking about a rumor." Lauren replied politely but firmly. "Even so, we cannot interrupt today's schedule because of someone standing outside in old clothes." Daniel remained silent, uncertain whom to believe. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Evelyn entered a small neighborhood church to rest for a few minutes before catching the next bus. She quietly placed a single dollar into the donation box, even though it was nearly all the cash she had left. Afterward, she sat alone in the last pew and gently opened the small blue package once more. She smiled at the child's drawing inside before carefully closing it again. "Just let him be happy," she whispered. "That is all I have ever wanted." Back at headquarters, Daniel quietly slipped the old photograph into his folder before anyone noticed. Something about Martha's certainty refused to leave his mind. As he prepared to escort Ethan to the next meeting, he looked once more at the faded image and suddenly realized that the silver locket around the young woman's neck looked exactly like the one he had glimpsed through the lobby window only minutes earlier. Daniel slipped the photograph back into his folder, but the image refused to leave his mind. During the luncheon, Ethan answered questions about investments and community programs with his usual confidence, yet Daniel noticed his employer seemed distracted. Several times Ethan glanced toward the windows overlooking the city, as though expecting to see someone standing there. When the meeting finally ended, Daniel made a quiet decision. As everyone gathered their papers, he stepped beside Ethan and spoke carefully. "Sir, may I have a private moment? It concerns something unusual that happened outside before your speech." Ethan immediately sensed the seriousness in his voice. They walked into a quiet conference room where Daniel placed the faded photograph on the table. Ethan studied it silently. His eyes settled on the smiling young woman wearing a silver locket. "Who is she?" he asked. Daniel answered honestly. "Martha believes she saw this woman outside the building today." Ethan looked up with confusion. "That photograph must be over 30 years old." Daniel nodded. "I know how impossible it sounds, but Martha has never made claims like this before." Before Ethan could respond, Martha herself entered the room after receiving Daniel's message. She apologized for interrupting such an important day, then quietly described everything she had seen. She explained the worn coat, the gentle smile, the blue package, and finally the silver locket that looked exactly like the one in the old photograph. Ethan listened without speaking. His heartbeat slowly quickened. For years, he had funded investigators across the country, followed countless false leads, and endured endless disappointments. Hope had become something he no longer allowed himself to feel. "Where is she now?" he finally asked. Martha lowered her eyes. "I do not know. She left before I could reach her." Silence filled the room. Ethan walked toward the window overlooking the plaza below. The bench across the street now sat empty. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering the strange connection he had felt when the motorcade passed the elderly woman earlier that afternoon. At almost the same time, Evelyn stepped off a city bus several miles away and returned to the small church where volunteers often served evening meals. Before entering, she noticed an elderly man struggling to carry several grocery bags across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, she picked up 2 of the heavy bags and walked beside him until they reached his apartment building. The grateful man thanked her repeatedly, but Evelyn only smiled and wished him good health. She never mentioned that her own feet ached from walking or that she had nowhere permanent to call home. Later that evening, while the church volunteers prepared dinner, one of them noticed the delicate silver locket around Evelyn's neck. "That is beautiful," she said kindly. Evelyn opened it for only a second, revealing the faded photograph inside before gently closing it again. Across the city, Ethan picked up the old family picture one more time. His eyes widened as he suddenly noticed the same distinctive locket hanging around the young woman's neck. And for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to wonder whether destiny had just come within a few feet of him before quietly walking away. The next morning, Ethan canceled 2 executive meetings, something his staff had rarely seen him do. He stood alone in his office, staring at the old photograph, while the first light of day spread across the Chicago skyline. The silver locket, the gentle smile, the strange feeling that had settled in his heart the moment he looked through the limousine window. None of it made sense, yet none of it would leave his mind. He pressed the intercom and asked Daniel to gather every record connected to the Carter family's search from the past 30 years. Within an hour, boxes filled with reports, letters, photographs, and investigator notes covered the conference table. Most had ended the same way. No confirmed sightings, no reliable witnesses, no answers. Martha quietly entered, carrying a small wooden frame she had found in the company archives. Inside was another family photograph, taken during Ethan's 5th birthday party. His eyes immediately focused on the woman standing beside him. Around her neck hung the same distinctive silver locket. Ethan carefully compared it with the enlarged image captured from a security camera outside the gala entrance. Although the camera quality was poor, the outline of the necklace appeared remarkably similar. Hope slowly replaced disbelief. "Find her," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "We will search every shelter, every church, and every community center in the city." Across town, Evelyn spent the morning helping volunteers prepare breakfast at the neighborhood church. She folded blankets, poured coffee, and greeted every visitor with the same warm kindness she had always offered, never mentioning her own struggles. When a young mother arrived looking overwhelmed while caring for 2 small children, Evelyn quietly entertained the little ones with the tiny wooden toy car from her blue package while their mother finished her meal. The children laughed as the little car rolled across the table, and Evelyn smiled with gentle affection before carefully placing it back inside the package. One of the volunteers noticed the old toy. "It must be very special," she said. Evelyn nodded. "It belonged to someone I have loved every day of my life." She never said another word. By afternoon, Daniel and Martha visited the church after receiving a call that an elderly woman matching Martha's description often volunteered there. Their hearts raced as they entered the building. Martha scanned every table, every hallway, every smiling face. Then a volunteer approached with a kind expression. "Are you looking for Miss Evelyn?" Martha's eyes widened instantly. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. The volunteer smiled sadly. "You just missed her. She left about 5 minutes ago after helping us clean the dining room." Martha hurried outside, but the sidewalk was already crowded with buses and afternoon traffic. Evelyn had disappeared once again. Back inside the church, the volunteer remembered something. "She forgot this," she said, lifting a neatly folded handkerchief from the chair where Evelyn had been sitting. As Martha unfolded it, a small handwritten note slipped onto the floor. Daniel picked it up carefully. His expression changed the moment he read the first line, because the note was addressed to someone named Ethan. Daniel carefully unfolded the handwritten note and immediately recognized the graceful handwriting of someone much older. He looked at Martha before quietly reading the words aloud. To Ethan, "If life has been kind to you, then I already have everything I ever prayed for. You do not owe me anything except a happy heart. I have watched from a distance for many years, and seeing the man you became has been the greatest blessing of my life." The room fell completely silent. Martha covered her mouth with trembling hands. Daniel continued reading. "One day, if God allows it, perhaps we will meet again. Until then, remember that love never disappears, even when people do." Ethan listened without moving. Every word felt strangely familiar, as though his heart had remembered a voice his mind had forgotten. Daniel turned the note over and noticed a small address written in one corner. It belonged to the neighborhood church where the note had been found. Ethan stood immediately. "We are going there now." Within minutes, the black SUV pulled away from headquarters, carrying Ethan, Daniel, and Martha across the city. During the drive, Ethan held the old photograph in one hand and the folded note in the other. He compared every detail again and again. The smile, the handwriting, the silver locket. None of it proved anything, yet together they formed a story he could no longer ignore. When they arrived at the church, volunteers welcomed them warmly. The pastor recognized Martha and remembered the elderly woman they were searching for. "Miss Evelyn helps here whenever she can," he explained. "She never asks for anything. She only asks how she can serve others." Ethan quietly looked around the simple dining hall where dozens of people shared an evening meal. Everything about the place felt peaceful. The pastor smiled gently before leading them to a small storage cabinet. "She left something here this afternoon because she said it would be safer than carrying it everywhere." From the cabinet, he carefully removed a neatly wrapped blue package. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. His hands shook as he slowly untied the worn ribbon. Inside rested a tiny wooden toy car, a faded birthday card, and a child's drawing of a smiling family standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Ethan's breathing caught. He remembered the toy immediately. He remembered pushing it across the living room floor as a little boy, while a loving voice laughed beside him. Turning over the birthday card, he found his own uneven childhood signature written in crayon. Tears quietly filled his eyes before he even realized they were there. Martha gently touched his shoulder, but said nothing. The pastor looked at Ethan with quiet understanding. "She told me this package belonged to the most important person in her life," he said softly. "She carried it every day because she never stopped believing she would return it to its rightful owner." Ethan carefully closed the box against his chest. "Where is she now?" he asked with growing urgency. The pastor glanced toward the church entrance before answering. "She volunteers every Friday morning at Lincoln Community Park, serving breakfast to anyone who needs it." Ethan looked at the clock on the wall. Friday morning was only a few hours away. Friday morning arrived beneath a clear blue sky as volunteers arranged folding tables across Lincoln Community Park. Fresh coffee filled the cool morning air, while families, veterans, and elderly neighbors gathered quietly for breakfast. Evelyn stood behind one of the tables, wearing the same faded brown coat, gently placing fruit, bread, and warm meals onto trays with the same quiet kindness she had shown everyone she met. She greeted each person with a smile, never allowing anyone to feel ashamed for accepting help. A little boy accidentally dropped his orange onto the sidewalk. Before anyone else could react, Evelyn picked it up, cleaned it carefully with a napkin, and handed it back with a warm smile. The child hugged her without hesitation, and Evelyn softly laughed as she patted his shoulder. At that very moment, a black sport utility vehicle slowly entered the park. Ethan stepped out first, followed by Daniel and Martha. His eyes searched every corner of the gathering until they finally stopped on the elderly woman standing beneath a white volunteer tent. Time seemed to stand completely still. Martha quietly whispered, "It is her." Ethan took one slow step forward, then another. He could hear nothing except the sound of his own heartbeat. Evelyn looked up after hearing footsteps approach. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. They simply stared into each other's eyes. Ethan noticed the silver locket resting against her coat, exactly as it appeared in every old photograph. Evelyn noticed the familiar kindness in his face, the same gentle eyes she remembered from a little boy who once laughed while chasing a wooden toy car across the living room floor. Ethan slowly opened the blue package he had carried from the church. He carefully lifted the tiny wooden car into his hand. Evelyn's eyes immediately filled with tears. Then he unfolded the faded birthday card, revealing the childish signature written decades earlier. His voice trembled as he quietly asked, "Did you keep all of this for me?" Evelyn nodded softly. Every single day. Ethan could no longer hold back the emotion that had lived inside him for so many years. With tears running freely down his face, he whispered the one word he had dreamed of saying since childhood. "Mom." Evelyn covered her mouth as tears streamed down her own cheeks. "My sweet boy," she whispered. Ethan stepped forward and embraced her gently, while the entire park grew silent around them. Volunteers stopped serving breakfast. Families paused their conversations. Even strangers watching from nearby benches understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Martha quietly wiped away her own tears, while Daniel looked on with a grateful smile. After several long moments, Ethan took Evelyn's hand and turned toward everyone gathered in the park. "Today," he said with quiet conviction, "I found the greatest blessing of my life. From this day forward, our foundation will expand every shelter, every family search program, and every meal service because no one should ever be forgotten." The crowd responded with warm applause, but Evelyn simply squeezed her son's hand and smiled. She had never wanted wealth, recognition, or comfort. She had only hoped that her son would grow into a kind man. Looking into his eyes, she realized that prayer had already been answered long before they found each other again.